The gnome hit the hedge with a satisfying thud and dropped out of sight into the long grass on the other side. Harry watched the spot where it had disappeared, half expecting it to come crawling back with that particular expression gnomes seemed to specialize in, somewhere between outrage and dim confusion. But nothing moved. The grass swayed once in the warm afternoon air, and then went still. He supposed that was that. He stood at the edge of the Weasleys' garden with his hands in his pockets, not entirely sure what to do next. That was, if he was being honest with himself, the problem with this whole afternoon. He didn't know what to do next. Nobody was asking him to do anything. And the combination of those two facts had been sitting in his chest since breakfast, like something slightly too large for the space it occupied. Not uncomfortable exactly, just present. A feeling he couldn't quite name, which bothered him more than the feeling itself. The burrow was behind him. He could hear it even from here, the low, cheerful clatter of dishes being dealt with somewhere inside. A radio playing something that wasn't quite music and wasn't quite news, but seemed to be an enthusiastic mixture of both. Once, a burst of laughter from upstairs. Ron's, he thought, though he couldn't be certain. Laughter carried differently here than he was used to, less guarded, less like something that needed to be watched in case it drew the wrong kind of attention. He had arrived 2 days ago, via flu powder, with ash in his hair and soot down the front of his shirt, stumbling out of the Weasleys' kitchen fireplace into a Wednesday morning that smelled of toast and something faintly herbal he couldn't identify. Molly had been standing right there, and she had pulled him into a hug before he'd finished catching his balance, patting his back firmly in the way that made it briefly impossible to tell whether she was welcoming him or checking him for damage, possibly both. "You look peaky," she had said, holding him at arm's length to inspect his face, with the focused concern of someone assessing a plant that hadn't been watered properly. "I'm fine," he had said, because that was the answer one gave. She'd looked at him for a moment longer than the answer warranted. "Well, you'll eat properly while you're here." Not an argument, not a concession, just a plain statement of what was now going to be true, delivered in the tone with which someone might announce that Tuesday followed Monday. He had eaten properly. 3 meals yesterday, with pudding after the evening one. He had sat at a table that was too small for the number of people around it, and listened to 5 different conversations happening at once, and felt, the entire time, a quiet, persistent amazement that kept catching him off guard. This morning, Molly had found him in the kitchen before anyone else was properly awake. He hadn't planned it. He had simply woken early, as he usually did. An old habit from years of trying to be out of bed and invisible before the Dursleys emerged. He had come downstairs because lying in a room that wasn't his own, in a house that was still learning the sound of him, had felt more alert than restful. The kitchen was the warmest room he'd found so far. He had sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a glass of pumpkin juice, not thinking about anything in particular, watching the clock on the wall through the early morning quiet. The clock was one of the things about the burrow that Harry found himself returning to. The way you return to something you can't quite explain. It was large and old, its face crowded with 9 hands rather than 2. And instead of numbers, it showed things like home and school and mortal peril, which Harry thought was quite a lot to put on a clock, though he understood why Molly might feel it was necessary. Each hand bore the name of a Weasley. 9 hands, 9 names. He had found Ron's hand last night, positioned just to the left of home, and had spent a moment simply looking at it, at the fact of a clock that had been made, actually made, to keep track of where each member of a family was. Not their appointments, not the time, where they were. whether they were all right. He was looking at it again now in his memory, which was perhaps why he didn't hear Molly on the stairs. "Harry dear, you're up." She had said it the way people sometimes say things they are glad are true. He had turned, and she was already moving toward the kettle, with the particular efficiency of someone who had been beginning mornings in this kitchen for more years than he had been alive. "Couldn't sleep?" "I sleep fine," he had said. A pause. "I just wake up early." She had glanced at him briefly, with a look he had not quite been able to read, and then turned back to the kettle and said nothing, which was somehow more considerate than anything she might have said. Later, after breakfast, after Ron had gone back upstairs to do something involving a Chudley Cannons poster and a permanent sticking charm that Percy had declared both unnecessary and inadvisable, Molly had told Harry to go outside and enjoy the sunshine. "You don't have to help with anything," she had said, with a particular emphasis that suggested she had anticipated he might offer. "You're a guest. Go and relax." He had gone outside. He was relaxing. He was standing in the garden with his hands in his pockets, having just thrown a gnome over a hedge, and he was relaxing. The problem, and he was aware dimly that it was a strange problem to have, was that he did not have a great deal of experience with this. Relaxing, specifically. The unstructured, nobody needs anything, afternoon is simply yours variety of relaxing. At the Dursleys, any stillness had been a careful thing, measured, deliberate. The kind of quiet you maintained by being useful enough not to be noticed, or small enough not to be in the way. He had learned early that free time was a category that did not quite apply to him at Privet Drive. Or if it did, it was a category best filled with chores, because chores at least were a legible role. You understood where you were when you were doing something. When you stopped doing something, the question of where you were became less clear. At school, it was different, but not entirely unlike. At Hogwarts, there was always something. Homework, or lessons, or Quidditch practice, or one of the various improbable situations that had developed a habit of finding him. And on the occasions when there wasn't, there were Ron and Hermione, the comfortable hum of the common room, the sense that existing in that space was, itself, a kind of belonging. Here, now, on a warm summer afternoon in a garden that smelled of cut grass and something flowering near the fence, with nothing he was supposed to be doing and nowhere he was supposed to be, Harry found himself at a slight loss. He picked up another gnome, mostly for something to do with his hands. It bit him. "Ow," he said, to no one. The gnome glared at him with the righteously offended expression of a creature that has been picked up against its will and intends to express this clearly. Harry held it out at arm's length, turned, and aimed for the far end of the garden, well away from the hedge this time. The gnome sailed in a long arc, landed in a patch of weeds with a thump and a muffled complaint. He stood looking at the weeds for a moment. Then he turned around and looked at the burrow. It was an extraordinary house when you looked at it properly. Harry had tried to look at it properly several times since arriving and kept finding new things. A window that hadn't been there yesterday, or that he hadn't noticed, which amounted to the same thing in a house like that. This. A set of wind chimes, made from what appeared to be old wand holsters. A weather vane on the topmost roof that seemed to be pointing in a direction that had no agreed-upon name. The house gave the impression of having been added to gradually, over a very long period of time, by people who were enthusiastic rather than architectural. It leaned in 3 directions simultaneously and appeared to be held upright by a combination of structural optimism and magic. and it was the most alive building Harry had ever been in. At Hogwarts, the castle itself sometimes felt watchful, its corridors shifting with something that might have been intention. The Burrow felt different from that, less watchful and more simply present, warm in the way of something that has absorbed a great deal of living over the years and kept most of it. He could still hear the kitchen radio from where he stood. Something clanged lightly, and then a burst of steam drifted past the kitchen window, which was cracked open to let out the warmth of whatever Molly had already started for this evening. Though it was barely past midday, Harry found his eyes going to that window and staying there. He thought about going back inside. Then he thought about what Molly had said. "You don't have to help with anything. You're a guest." And he put his hands back in his pockets and turned away from the window and looked at the garden again. A second gnome had reappeared near the fence, watching him with deep suspicion. He had not told Ron or Hermione or anyone what the summers at Privet Drive were actually like. Not the whole of it. Ron knew bits, had seen enough on the morning he and the twins had arrived in the flying Ford Anglia to understand that something was wrong with the shape of Harry's summers. But knowing something was wrong and knowing the particular texture of it were different things. The texture of it was this. 4 weeks into any summer, Harry always reached a point where he stopped knowing what was normal, what people did with their evenings when there was no threat and no particular purpose, how a family was supposed to sound. He had been at Hogwarts long enough by now to know that he loved it there, that it was the first place that had ever felt genuinely like his. But Hogwarts was a school, with timetables and purposes, and the steady structure of lessons. And it did not prepare you, especially for what a summer afternoon with nothing required of it was supposed to feel like. The Burrow was doing something to his understanding of that, and he wasn't sure yet what it was. It was in small things. The clock on the wall. The way Molly had said, "You're a guest," as though that were a category worth protecting. The fact that last night at dinner nobody had assigned seats, and nobody had checked whether he was eating the right amount. And it had simply been loud and crowded, and Mr. Weasley had asked him 3 questions about Muggle electricity with the focused excitement of someone who has been waiting to ask these questions for some time. And Harry had answered them, and it had been good. Simple in a way that felt complicated to explain. He had lain awake for a while after. Not anxiously, just turning it over. He degnomed 3 more gnomes with gradually improving aim. The last one cleared the hedge entirely and continued for some distance, judging by the sound it made landing, and Harry felt a small, uncomplicated satisfaction about this. The afternoon continued to be warm, and to have nothing in particular planned for it. He stood in the garden. The grass was uneven underfoot, sun-warm, scattered here and there with things the gnomes had dragged out of the earth. A rusty trowel, 2 mismatched buttons, something that might once have been a teapot handle and was now simply an interesting shape. Behind him, the Burrow settled and creaked gently, in the way of a house that is comfortable with itself. Above him, the sky was the particular blue of a July afternoon that is committed entirely to being an afternoon, and has no intention of becoming anything else for several hours yet. He breathed in. Grass. Something warm. Whatever Molly was cooking, drifting faintly out through the cracked kitchen window. He breathed out. He didn't know what to do with this quiet, undemanding, improbably lovely afternoon. He didn't have the first idea. But standing here in the garden, with the sun on the back of his neck, and the Weasleys' slightly unreliable house behind him, he found that he minded his not knowing slightly less than he had an hour ago. That, he thought, was probably something. He turned toward the house, not with any particular plan, and began walking back across the grass. The kitchen was empty when Harry came in through the back door. Not entirely empty. The wireless was still going in its low, unhurried way from the shelf above the icebox. A large pot on. The stove was doing something slow and aromatic that filled the whole room with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. And a single dish towel was folded over the edge of the sink with a particular neatness of something Molly had placed there on purpose. But Molly herself was gone. He could hear her upstairs, moving between rooms, the floorboards announcing her progress in the way of old houses that have given up keeping secrets about where people are. Harry stood in the doorway for a moment, one hand still on the doorframe, and looked at the kitchen. It was the kind of room that made you feel the weight of all the mornings it had seen. The ceiling was low and warmly yellowed. The table in the center was large and scarred with use. Ink stains, what looked like a burn mark near one corner that Harry privately suspected had something to do with Fred and George. A long scratch across the grain that might have been a knife, or might have been something altogether more imaginative. The walls were hung with things that accumulate over years rather than being chosen at once. A calendar 3 months out of date. A child's drawing of what was either a dragon or a very confident dog. 2 or 3 recipes written on scraps of parchment, fixed to the plaster with charms that had gone slightly sideways over time, giving each one a faint, persistent shimmer. The pot stirred itself, just once, slowly, and then stopped, as though it had remembered it was only part way through a thought. Harry came inside and let the door close behind him. He stood at the edge of the kitchen and looked at the pot, then at the counter beside the stove, where a collection of vegetables had been left in various stages of preparation, some chopped, some not yet started. A knife resting on a wooden board beside a heap of carrots that had clearly been interrupted mid-task. Molly had been in the middle of something when she'd gone upstairs, and whatever had called her up there had called her quickly enough that she hadn't stopped to put things away first. Harry looked at the carrots. He looked at the knife. He looked at the stairs. He could hear Molly still moving around up there, a door opening, the sound of something being shifted, a brief exchange of words with someone who was probably Ginny, though he couldn't make it out clearly. He crossed the kitchen to the counter. He picked up the knife. He picked up a carrot. He didn't think about it in any deliberate way. It wasn't a decision so much as a quiet movement towards something that felt, in a way he couldn't have explained, simply right. The way stepping out of rain into shelter felt right. Not because you had thought it through, but because the shelter was there, and you were wet, and the logic of it required no examination. He began chopping the carrot. He was not, it had to be said, a particularly skilled cook. What he knew from years of making breakfast for the Dursleys under instruction. And the instruction had been less, here is how one properly prepares a meal, and more, do it again. The yolks were wrong. He had learned through repetition and correction rather than guidance, which meant he knew how to do several things adequately and had large gaps where the rest of cooking was supposed to go. He chopped the carrots carefully. They came out in pieces that were not uniform, but were at least roughly similar in size, which he thought was probably the important part. He set them aside and started on what appeared to be a parsnip. He was less certain about the parsnip, but it behaved more or less like the carrot had, so he proceeded with cautious confidence. The kitchen was quiet around him in a way that felt inhabited rather than empty. The wireless murmured. The pot on the stove made occasional soft sounds of contentment. Somewhere outside, one of the gnomes had apparently found its way back over the hedge and was making its feelings known, in the distinctive way of gnomes, which was to say loudly and without much coherent structure. Harry found his shoulders doing the same thing they had done in the garden, coming down, fractionally, from where they'd been sitting up near his ears without him noticing. He picked up another parsnip. "Harry?" He turned around. Molly was standing at the bottom of the stairs with a stack of folded laundry against her hip, looking at him with an expression he couldn't immediately read. Not surprised, exactly, or rather, surprised in the way of someone who has been surprised by something they probably should have expected, which is a different kind of surprise entirely. Harry became aware, quite suddenly, of the knife in his hand, the half-chopped parsnip on the board. The fact that he had been standing in someone else's kitchen cutting their vegetables without being asked. Sorry, he said. You were upstairs, and it looked like you'd been in the middle of... I just thought... I can stop." He was aware that this was not one of his more articulate moments. Molly looked at him for a moment. Then she crossed to the other side of the kitchen, set the laundry on the chair by the door, and came to stand beside him at the counter. She looked at the carrots he'd cut. She looked at the parsnip currently in progress. "Move over a bit." He moved over. She reached past him and picked up the larger of the two knives he hadn't used, turned to a courgette that had been waiting patiently at the far end of the board, and began cutting it, with the economical confidence of someone for whom this action had long since stopped requiring thought. Harry stood very still for a moment. That was all. No discussion, no "you really shouldn't," no instruction to go back outside and let the afternoon continue being unstructured and purposeless. She had simply made room for him, and continued. He turned back to the parsnip. They worked in silence for a while, side by side at the long counter, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that doesn't require filling, that has enough in it already. The wireless talked softly to itself. Outside, the gnome had apparently resolved its grievances, or at least moved them elsewhere. The pot stirred itself again, twice this time, with more conviction. Harry became aware slowly that this was something he had not done before. Not the chopping specifically, but this. Standing in a kitchen with someone, working alongside them, without any particular charge in the air. At the Dursleys, kitchens were rooms where things were expected of him, and whether he met those expectations or fell short of them determined the tenor of the rest of the day. This was different. This was simply a counter and a knife and the low warmth of a kitchen in the middle of a summer afternoon. And Molly beside him, dealing with the courgette. "You don't have to, you know," Molly said, without looking up. "I know," Harry said. A pause. "I wanted to," he added, which was true, though he would not have been able to say precisely what it was he had wanted. To do something with his hands, to be in the kitchen, to be useful in a context where usefulness was not a matter of survival. Some combination of the three that he didn't have a word for. Molly glanced at him sideways, brief, unhurried. The kind of glance that was also a question that had decided not to press itself. "All right," she said simply. And then she began to tell him about the courgettes, which had been grown in the garden by Arthur, who had become interested in Muggle vegetable cultivation and approached it with the same enthusiasm he brought to plugs and telephone directories, and who had last summer produced a marrow of such improbable size that they'd had to send Percy for help moving it. And Percy had arrived with a levitation spell and an expression of considerable personal suffering. Harry laughed, quietly, before he could decide whether to. It was around the point at which she moved on from the marrow, to the time Bill had attempted to grow something he'd read about in a book, and had produced instead a plant of such aggressive sociability that it had attempted to follow him to school, which Molly had forbidden, firmly, on the grounds that Hogwarts had enough going on, that Harry began to understand something about how Molly Weasley talked when she was doing something else at the same time. She talked the way the wireless murmured, not as performance, not because anyone had asked, but because talking was simply what the kitchen sounded like when she was in it. The stories came out in the same rhythm as the chopping, steady, unhurried, occasionally interrupted by the need to check the pot or move something from one surface to another, and then picked back up exactly where they'd left off, as though the story had simply waited patiently for her to come back to it. He had not heard anyone talk like this before. At the Dursleys, talking over meals was a formal thing, with topics, and an understanding of which topics were permitted. At Hogwarts, conversation was livelier, but also purposeful. There was always a direction it was heading. This was different. This was talking the way breathing was breathing, not heading anywhere exactly, just continuing. He found himself listening with the whole of his attention, which surprised him, because the stories weren't about anything urgent. They were about Bill as a young boy, the marrow, the plant that had wanted to come to school, the time Molly had turned around mid-cooking to find the twins had reorganized the spice cabinet in an order that appeared to be based entirely on which names they found most entertaining. But he was listening closely, not because the stories demanded it, but because there was something in them, catching at something he couldn't immediately identify. "Can I ask?" he said, and stopped. Molly looked at him. "What order did they reorganize the spices in?" It wasn't, he knew, what he'd been about to ask, but the real question had retreated before he could get to it, and this one had offered itself instead. Molly's expression did something complicated and warm. "Apparently," she said, "the correct order of spices, according to Fred and George Weasley at age 8, is funniest name first. So we had asafoetida at the front, and then a long gap, and then everything else." "What's asafoetida?" "I have absolutely no idea," Molly said. "But they'd apparently found it at the back of the cabinet and felt it deserved prominent placement, on the grounds of the name." Harry considered this. "They're not wrong," he said. Molly gave him a long look of theatrical suffering that did not hide the affection underneath it at all, and turned back to the stove. He set aside the parsnips he'd finished and looked along the counter to see what remained. There was a pile of something leafy he was less certain about, a bowl of what appeared to be shallots, and something else entirely that he didn't recognize, and decided to leave for Molly to deal with. He started on the shallots. The skin of a shallot, he discovered, was more resistant to being removed than it looked. It required more patience than the carrots had. He worked at it steadily, aware that he was being slightly slower than was probably professional, but moving forward regardless. "You peel them away from the root end," Molly said, from beside him, without making a point of it. "Like that, yes." He adjusted his grip. It was easier. "Thanks," he said. "Arthur does them exactly the same way you were," she said. "Even now, every time. I have told him probably 40 times. Does he get there in the end? Eventually, with some feeling. Harry worked at the shallot. It came apart properly this time. He felt something very small and quiet settle in his chest, something that had been slightly braced, without him being aware it was braced, easing fractionally into a different position, like a door that had been held carefully against a draft, finding that the draft had stopped, and being able to simply close properly. He didn't examine it, he just let it be there. "Do you want me to start the other pot?" he asked, a little while later. Molly looked at the stove, assessing. "The blue one," she said. "Fill it about halfway. The tap runs cold for a few seconds first and then sorts itself out, so just wait for it." He crossed to the sink. The tap ran cold, exactly as she'd said, and then the water came through warm. He filled the pot to what looked like halfway and brought it back to the stove with both hands. Molly moved the other pot slightly to make room, without being asked. And the whole thing took perhaps 30 seconds, and nobody remarked on it at all. Harry stood back and looked at the stove. 2 pots now. The kitchen fuller and warmer than it had been when he came in. He had not been invited in, exactly. There had been no ceremony about it. She had simply moved over and handed him a roll. And the roll had turned out to fit without alteration. And the kitchen had continued being itself around him. He thought about the word guest and the emphasis Molly had put on it that morning, the careful, protective emphasis of someone who wanted to make sure he knew he didn't have to do anything. He wondered if she had understood, even then, that what he needed was not to be relieved of doing. What he needed was to be let in. He didn't ask. He went back to the shallots. The ladle was the first thing to go wrong. Not wrong, exactly. Molly would not have called it wrong, Harry would come to understand, because wrong implied something had departed from a plan. And in the Weasley kitchen, the plan had always accounted for a certain degree of independent initiative from the equipment. But from Harry's perspective, standing at the counter with a shallot in one hand and a moderate sense of his own usefulness in the other, the ladle's sudden decision to stir the large pot at approximately 3 times the recommended speed came as something of a surprise. The pot made a sound like a small, determined whirlpool. Harry turned around. The ladle was going at it with considerable commitment, its handle a blur, the contents of the pot traveling in a fast and opinionated circle, sending occasional ambitious drops over the rim and onto the stovetop, where they landed with small, indignant hisses. His first instinct, the instinct built from 3 years of Hogwarts and a lifetime before that of things going wrong in ways that required immediate action, was to do something, step in, intervene. He was already putting down the shallot, already half reaching toward the stove, before he caught himself. Because Molly, who was standing approximately 2 feet from the pot, was not intervening. She was reaching up to the shelf above the stove for a pinch of something dried and crumbling. And she was doing this with the focused calm of someone who has correctly assessed that the ladle, while enthusiastic, does not constitute a crisis. She dropped the dried herb into the pot without looking. The ladle slowed. Not immediately, not entirely. It continued at a somewhat elevated pace for another few seconds, like something winding down from strong feelings. But by the time Molly had replaced the jar on the shelf and turned her attention back to what she'd been doing before, the stirring had returned to a rhythm that could reasonably be described as measured. "It does that," Molly said, as though this explained and concluded the matter. "Does it do it often?" Harry asked. "More when it's been left alone for a bit. Arthur says it gets bored." Harry looked at the ladle. The ladle stirred on, apparently indifferent to being discussed. "Does he think the ladle has opinions?" "Arthur," Molly said, in the tone of someone who's been married for a long time and has arrived at a place of informed acceptance, "thinks most things have opinions. Last month, he had a 20-minute conversation with the shed door about whether it preferred to open inward or out." What did the shed door think? Inward, apparently. Arthur was very pleased about this. Harry went back to the shallots, but he kept one eye on the stove, which he was beginning to understand operated on its own system of priorities. The kitchen had a temperature to it now, not just warmth, but a specific, layered heat that came from 2 pots going and the oven doing something slow below and the afternoon sun that had found the window and was making the most of it. The smells had built up and become something complicated. The herbs Molly kept adding in small, considered pinches. The shallots Harry was still working through. Something sweet from the oven that he hadn't asked about because it had seemed like something that would reveal itself when it was ready. He was getting the hang of the shallots. The trick, he'd found, was patience. Not forcing them, but working at the layers in order. Which was the kind of lesson that sounded like it was about something else, but was really just about shallots. He set another finished one in the bowl and reached for the next. Behind him, the second pot, the blue one he'd filled and put on the stove, began very quietly to drift. He noticed it from the corner of his eye first, a slight movement that didn't belong to boiling or stirring. He turned around properly. The blue pot had moved approximately 4 inches to the left of where he'd placed it. It was not doing anything dramatic. It was simply elsewhere than it had been, sitting on the stovetop with an air of innocence that Harry found unconvincing. He looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Molly, who was at the far end of the counter doing something with a length of string and several sprigs of something he didn't know the name of, her back mostly to him. "Mrs. Weasley?" "The blue pot has moved." A brief pause in the string tying. "Has it gone left or right?" Harry looked at the pot. "Left." "That's fine. It does that when it's heating up. It'll come back." Harry watched the pot. It sat. He watched it for another moment. It moved back to the right, not all the way to where it had started, but closer, like something that had taken a small personal journey and was now prepared to admit that the original position had merit. "It came back," Harry reported. "Good," said Molly, already back to the string. Harry turned to the remaining shallots, with the expression of someone recalibrating their understanding of what kitchens were, broadly speaking, capable of. The next thing was the bowl. The bowl had been on the counter since before Harry came in, a large, heavy, cream-colored bowl that had held the carrots he'd cut earlier, now empty and pushed to the side. He had not thought about the bowl. The bowl had given no indication that it intended to become relevant. But as he moved along the counter to reach for the last of the shallots, his elbow caught the bowl, and the bowl moved. And for one clear, suspended second, Harry watched it travel toward the edge of the counter, with the slow certainty of something that has decided what it's going to do and is doing it. He grabbed for it, missed. The bowl went over the edge and stopped. It hung in the air approximately 8 inches from the floor, perfectly level, with the mild expression of something that has been caught before and is not surprised to find itself caught again. Harry stared at it. The bowl hung. After a moment, it rose smoothly back to the counter and resettled itself exactly where it had been, as though the whole affair had been a brief excursion rather than an incident. Harry straightened up slowly. The bowl, he started. Charm on most of the crockery, Molly said, without looking up. After the incident with the twins and the casserole dish, I did the lot. It was either that or replace things every other week. What was the incident with the casserole dish? I have made a decision, Molly said serenely, not to revisit that particular story until enough time has passed that it's funny. We're at about 3 years. I think I need another 2, minimum. Harry looked at the bowl, which sat on the counter looking entirely ordinary and blameless. That's actually brilliant, he said, charming all the crockery. Necessity, said Molly. I'll put it on their record of achievements if they ever ask. He finished the last shallot and brought the bowl over to Molly, who tipped them into the larger pot with a practiced motion. And the kitchen immediately smelled different, sharper, warmer, more itself. Harry stood back and surveyed what he'd done, which was not very much in absolute terms, but which had, he thought, contributed. The carrots and parsnips he'd cut were incorporated now, and the shallots, and the pot he'd filled was coming up to heat, and doing so in roughly the correct place. These were not large things, but they were things. He was aware, standing there in the steam and warmth, that his earlier self, the one who had stood in the garden with nothing to do and hadn't known what to do with the not doing, felt like a previous chapter of the afternoon rather than part of the same one. Not far away, but distinct. As though he'd come through a door he hadn't particularly noticed walking through. Molly was adding something from a small brown jar to the pot, measured in her palm rather than with a spoon, with the confidence of someone who had made this particular calculation 10,000 times and no longer needed instruments for it. What's that? Harry asked. Marjoram. Arthur doesn't like it, but he never notices when it's in the stew, which I consider a resolution of the disagreement. Harry considered this approach to conflict resolution. Does it work, him not noticing? Without fail, for 11 years. She replaced the jar. Some problems, she said, in the tone of someone imparting practical wisdom, can be waited out. The afternoon had shifted without Harry noticing when it had happened. The light through the kitchen window was a different quality now, less overhead and more sideways, the particular gold of a summer evening that was still a few hours away, but had begun sending advance notice of itself across the floors and walls. Harry was drying a pot that Molly had washed. She had handed it to him without discussing it, simply held it out in his direction while she dealt with something else. And he had taken it and found the dish towel, which was where it had been when he came in, folded over the sink. The wireless had changed programs at some point and was now playing something that was actually music, a low and comfortable sort of jazz that suited the kitchen better than the news that wasn't quite news had. Though Harry wouldn't have said so if asked, because it wasn't the kind of observation he generally offered. Fred and George used to try to change the wireless, Molly said, as though she had heard him not saying it. They had a phase of about 2 months where they were convinced they could get it to play Celestina Warbeck at double speed, for reasons of their own. Did they manage it? They managed to make it play Celestina Warbeck backwards for a week, which nobody wanted, including Fred and George about 48 hours in. We had to bring in someone from the ministry to reverse it. Arthur considered it a very informative experience about the nature of magical objects and unintended consequences. I considered it a very long week. Harry dried the pot with more attention than it technically required, because it gave him something to do with his face while he decided whether to laugh. He laughed. It was funny, Molly conceded. Later, not during. She handed him the ladle, the same ladle that had been stirring at speed an hour earlier, and he took it and dried it and put it on the counter. and it sat there with no particular ambitions. Harry thought that perhaps it really had just been bored. The oven made a satisfied sound, low and rounded, like a sigh of things going according to plan. 20 more minutes on that, Molly said. To herself or to the oven, it wasn't entirely clear. Harry folded the dish towel and hung it back over the sink. What can I do next? He asked. Molly looked around the kitchen with the assessing gaze of someone taking inventory. Then she looked at him, not the quick sideways glance from earlier, but properly, briefly, with something in her expression he couldn't name, but that sat warmly somewhere in his chest when she looked away again. The table needs setting, she said. Plates in the cupboard on the left, 7 of everything, and put a large spoon out for Ron, because he'll only go looking for one and make a great deal of noise about it. A great deal of noise, Harry repeated. It's best to simply anticipate these things, Molly said wisely, and turned back to the stove. Harry went to the cupboard on the left. He counted out 7 plates. He thought about the clock on the wall, 9 hands, 9 names. He thought about the sound the house made when it had everyone in it. The way the table was already a slightly impossible size for the number of people that sat around it. And he felt, quietly, without fanfare, that setting it was exactly where he was supposed to be. The plates were heavier than they looked, not in an inconvenient way. They were just substantial. The kind of crockery that had been used so many times it had acquired a density beyond its actual weight. The way things do when they have been part of enough meals to mean something. Harry set the first one down at the head of the table and stood back, considering the geometry of 7 places around a table that comfortably sat 5, and decided the best approach was simply to begin and adjust as he went. He set the plates out in a rough circle, shifting one, then another, until the spacing felt approximately even. Which it wasn't, but which was close enough that nobody would measure it. He found the cutlery in the drawer Molly had indicated with a brief sideways nod, and he laid it out carefully, knife and fork either side, the way he'd seen it done enough times to know the shape of it, even if he hadn't had cause to practice it much. He put out a large spoon at Ron's place. Then he stood back and looked at the table. It looked, he thought, like a table about to be used, which was the correct thing for a table to look like. He felt a modest satisfaction about this. Behind him, Molly was moving between the stove and the counter with the unhurried efficiency of someone running a system so well rehearsed it no longer required deliberate thought. She checked the large pot, adjusted something, moved a pan, checked the oven without opening it, just rested her hand briefly on the door, assessing by feel, and then straightened up and turned to look at the table. Good, she said, in the tone of someone who means it without elaborating on it. Then she looked at the cutlery. Fork on the left. Harry looked at the cutlery he'd laid. The forks were on the right. Right, he said. Left, Molly said. He went around the table and moved the forks. Molly watched for a moment, and then went back to the stove. And Harry appreciated, without remarking on it, that she had not made anything of the mistake, had not repeated it, had not added a footnote about why it mattered, just said the correction once, clearly, and moved on. He set the last fork down on the left. Percy, Molly said, from somewhere behind him in the fond and slightly exasperated tone that seemed to accompany that name specifically, used to lay the table for me when he was small. He was 6. He measured the distance between the fork and the plate with a ruler. Harry turned around. His own idea? Entirely. I came in one morning to find him on his second pass around the table, because the first pass hadn't been consistent enough. He was 6, she said again, as though this still surprised her at some level, despite having had years to absorb it. Harry looked at the table he'd just laid, which was notably not measured with a ruler. Is his still the best laid table in the family? By his own assessment, yes. Molly's voice carried something warm and dry. He has not been shy about this view. Harry pulled out the chair at the far end of the table and sat down. Not because dinner was anywhere near ready, but because standing in a kitchen watching someone else cook had a natural limit, and he had reached it. Sitting felt less like being underfoot. Molly didn't comment on this. She turned from the stove to reach for something on the shelf, and as she moved, she began talking, the same easy, unhurried way she had been talking all afternoon. The stories rising out of the rhythm of what her hands were doing, the way steam rose from the pot. Bill used to be in the garden at this hour, she said. Every evening, from about age 8 right up until Hogwarts. Whatever the weather. Even in November, he'd come in with his shoes completely destroyed and some item he'd found in the soil that he was convinced was important. What kind of items? Rocks, mostly. Old ones. He had a theory that old rocks had memories in them. She added something to the pot without measuring it. He'd bring them in and line them up on the windowsill, and when I asked him what they were for, he'd say he was keeping them until they were ready to tell him. Did any of them ever tell him anything? Not that he mentioned, but he kept them for years regardless. There's probably still a box of them in his old room. He became a curse breaker in the end. Works in Egypt, ancient tombs, old objects. She was quiet for a moment. I think the rocks were preparation. There was something in the way she said it. Not dramatically, not as a revelation, just as a thing she had thought about and arrived at, that made Harry sit very still for a second. The idea that an 8-year-old collecting rocks from a garden in Devon might have been, without knowing it, practicing for who he was going to become. He had not thought before about childhood as something that contained the person you were heading toward. He wasn't sure what he thought about that. He filed it somewhere to return to later. And Percy was the opposite? He asked. Molly looked up. What makes you say that? The ruler, Harry said. For the table. That seems less like exploration and more like wanting things in the right place. Molly considered him for a moment, with an expression that was either pleased or simply interested. Harry couldn't tell which. Percy, she said carefully, needed to know the rules before he could relax. Once he knew the rules, he was fine. More than fine, actually. He could be very funny, Percy, when he wasn't worried about getting something wrong. But he had to have the structure in place first. She moved to check the oven. Bill never needed the structure. Percy couldn't do without it. And they used to worry that Percy was somehow... She paused, considering the word. Less adventurous. Less free. But, Harry said, because there was clearly a but. But Bill rang from Egypt last summer, and he'd gone somewhere he wasn't supposed to go, into a tomb without proper clearance, and he'd had quite a difficult week because of it. A small smile. And Percy sent me an 11-page letter at Christmas, outlining his concerns about ministry regulations regarding cauldron thickness. And I thought, no, they're both exactly who they are. They just needed different things. Harry looked at the table. He thought about the Dursleys' house, the particular kind of order that had been maintained there, the sense that everything needed to be in its correct place, and the correct place was determined by what reflected best on the family. He thought about how he had learned, young, to make himself small in that order, to take up as little of it as possible, and he thought, now, about the difference between that and Percy at 6 with his ruler. Percy measuring the distance between fork and plate, not because someone required it of him, but because it was the way his particular mind moved toward comfort. The difference, Harry thought, was that Percy's need for order had been held, not corrected, not labeled as a problem to be managed, just accepted as Percy's thing, the way Bill's rocks were Bill's thing. He didn't say any of this. It didn't feel like something to say out loud, but it sat in him with a weight that was not uncomfortable, settling into a place it seemed to have been looking for. "What about when they were both home at once?" Harry asked. "Bill and Percy. Did they get along?" Molly's expression did something complicated. "After a fashion. Bill used to take Percy's things off the shelves where Percy had arranged them and put them back slightly differently to see how long it took Percy to notice." "How long did it take?" "Approximately 4 seconds. Every time. You'd think Bill would have found this less entertaining after the first dozen times. But he did not." "And Percy?" "Percy would rearrange everything back in complete silence, with an expression of tremendous suffering, and then go and tell me about it in a very long and detailed account." She shook her head. "And then the next day, Bill would do it again." "And Percy would let him, even knowing he'd do it again?" "Percy would have considered not noticing a moral failure," Molly said simply. "He couldn't do it, so every day he noticed, and every day he rearranged, and every day he told me, and every day I told Bill to leave his brother's things alone. And Bill would say," she paused, "Yes, Mum," in a way that meant he was going to do it again tomorrow. Harry thought about this particular ecosystem with something approaching awe. How long did that go on? 3 summers, until Percy got to Hogwarts and his things were out of reach. She smiled. Bill was genuinely put out by this for at least a week. The oven made its low, satisfied sound again. Molly opened it this time. A billow of warm, sweetened air moved through the kitchen that made Harry sit up slightly, involuntarily. Whatever was in there was close. "Almost," Molly said, to the oven or to herself, and closed it again. She straightened up and looked around the kitchen with the assessing gaze of someone running down a list. Her eyes went to the table, and Harry watched her see the forks on the left and the large spoon at Ron's place, and something in her expression settled. "You did the glasses," she said. He hadn't. He'd forgotten the glasses. He started. "Cabinet above the kettle," she said, turning back to the stove. 7 tall ones, not the short ones. Those are for juice. Well, actually get both. The twins will want juice and Arthur will want both. And getting up to find a second glass is apparently beyond everyone in this family except me and possibly Percy. Harry got up and found the cabinet above the kettle. He counted out 7 tall glasses and set them beside the plates. Then he went back and counted out 7 short ones and put them in the spaces that remained, which required some rearrangement of the table's geography and brought the whole thing closer to cozy than spacious. He stepped back and looked at it. It was a crowded table, a table laid for more people than the table had technically been designed to accommodate, with forks now correctly on the left, a large spoon beside Ron's plate, glasses in 2 sizes, and the plates that were heavier than they looked set around in a circle that wasn't quite even, but was close. He thought about the clock on the wall, its 9 hands. He thought about Bill's rocks and Percy's ruler, both of them loved without qualification, not despite being different from each other, not with one held up as the model and the other as the variation. Both of them simply held. Upstairs, he could hear movement, Ron's voice, then Ginny's, then the particular thump of someone coming downstairs in more of a hurry than was strictly necessary. Dinner was getting closer. Harry sat back down in his chair at the far end of the table and looked at the kitchen, the pot stirring, the oven waiting, Molly at the stove, and felt the feeling he'd been trying to identify all afternoon move a little closer to the surface. Not yet nameable, but warmer than it had been. He was in no hurry to name it. The oven timer went off without warning. Not a gentle chime. A full, committed sound that filled the kitchen completely for about 3 seconds before Molly silenced it with a tap of her wand. The kind of automatic gesture that had long since stopped being deliberate and was just part of how she moved through the kitchen. Harry, who had been in a comfortable near stillness in his chair at the table, came back to the room with a small internal jolt that he didn't let reach his face. Molly opened the oven. The smell that came out was extraordinary. Warm and sweet and slightly spiced, with something underneath it that Harry couldn't name, but that registered somewhere below thought, in the part of the mind that deals with comfort, before the rest of it has a chance to weigh in. He straightened up in his chair without meaning to. "What is that?" he asked. "Apple crumble," Molly said, setting the dish on the counter with a cloth. "Ron asked for it yesterday. He asks for it every time he's been away for more than a week, without exception, since he was about 4. She said this the way she said most things about her children, not with the weight of nostalgia, but with the lightness of someone for whom these facts were simply the furniture of daily life, known and comfortable and not requiring display. Harry looked at the crumble. It was golden across the top, the edges just darker than the center, and it sat in its dish with the solid confidence of something that had been made many times before and knew exactly what it was. "He's never mentioned it," Harry said. "Ron, he talks about food a fair amount, but he's never mentioned the crumble." "People don't always mention the things that are simply there," Molly said, which was probably about Ron, and possibly about something else. And she moved on before Harry could decide which. She was checking the large pot when she began the story. Harry had not asked for it. That was the thing he kept noticing about the way Molly talked. The stories didn't require prompting or occasion. They rose out of whatever she was doing with the naturalness of something that had always been there and had simply found a moment to surface. "Fred and George," she said, lifting the lid on the pot and considering what she found, "went through a phase when they were about 8 of trying to enchant things." Things? Kitchen things, specifically. They had decided, and I don't know where this came from, I genuinely don't, that the kitchen would be more efficient if everything did its job without being asked. She replaced the lid. "In theory, this is not an unreasonable ambition. I do half of it myself. The difference is that I have a reasonable command of household charms, and Fred and George at 8 had enthusiasm, and almost no technique whatsoever." Harry, who had personal experience of magic performed with enthusiasm and insufficient technique, felt a recognition he didn't express. "What did they start with?" he asked. "The breakfast things. They waited until Arthur and I were in the garden, and they had a go at the eggs." "The eggs." "The eggs." Molly's voice had taken on the particular quality of someone approaching a story they have told before, but which retains its full effect regardless. "The intention, as they explained it to me afterward, was to get the eggs to scramble themselves, which is straightforward enough in principle. The problem was that they'd tried to charm the eggs and the pan and the spatula all at once, because Fred said doing them separately would take too long, and George agreed. Which is always the point at which things in this house have historically gone wrong. What happened? The eggs scrambled themselves, Molly said. On the ceiling. Harry stared at her. The ceiling. Every last one of them. 8 eggs, scrambled, distributed across the kitchen ceiling with what I can only describe as thoroughness. She picked up the wooden spoon and moved to the stove. It wasn't an explosion, that's the thing. It wasn't dramatic. I came in and everything looked normal for about 2 seconds. And then I looked up. The image arrived in Harry's mind fully formed. Molly coming into this kitchen on an ordinary morning and looking up and finding her ceiling. He felt the laugh coming from somewhere low in his chest, different from the careful, testing laughs he'd been producing all afternoon. This one just happened. "I'm sorry," he said, not very convincingly. "You're not," said Molly, and she was smiling, which meant it was allowed. He laughed, properly this time. Not loudly, but genuinely, with his whole attention in it. The kind of laugh that leaves you slightly surprised at yourself. "What did you do?" I stood in my kitchen for a moment, looking at my scrambled eggs on my ceiling, and I made a decision. She stirred the pot with calm authority. I decided that I was not going to address it until I'd had a cup of tea. That seems reasonable. I thought so. I put the kettle on and I sat at this table and I had my tea. And the eggs were on the ceiling, and Fred and George were standing in the doorway. They hadn't left, to their credit. They'd stayed to see what happened. And they didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything. And then, when I'd finished my tea, I told them to get the mop. They mopped the ceiling? They tried. It was a process. Arthur came in halfway through and stood looking at them, George on a chair, and Fred on Arthur's shoulders, trying to reach the higher bits. And he didn't ask a single question. He just went and got a second mop. Harry thought about Mr. Weasley, who found plugs fascinating and had conversations with shed doors. Getting a second mop and climbing in to help his sons clean scrambled eggs off the ceiling without asking for an explanation first. Something moved in him, gentle but distinct, like a current under still water. He didn't tell them off? Oh, they were told off, Molly said. Thoroughly. I'm not suggesting the incident passed without comment, but the mopping came first. She glanced at him briefly. Arthur's view, and I've come around to it over the years, is that when something's gone wrong, the first useful thing is to help sort it out. The conversation about why it went wrong can happen after. Harry looked at the table. He turned this over. At the Dursleys, the sequence had always been the other way around. Sometimes the conversation about why it went wrong went on long enough that sorting it out became secondary. Or didn't happen at all. The emphasis had been on the fact of the wrongness, not the fixing of it. He didn't say this. He just sat with the contrast and let it be informative. The teapot was next, Molly said. Harry came back. Sorry? They didn't stop after the eggs. I should have anticipated this. I knew who I was dealing with, but I hoped. She moved to the counter, shaking her head with affectionate resignation. About a week later, they had another go, this time at the teapot. The intention was to get it to sing when the water was ready, instead of whistling. They had written the charm down. They showed it to me afterward. It was very nearly right, which is almost worse than being completely wrong. Because almost right means the charm worked, just not the way they'd planned. What did it do? It sang, Molly said. That part worked fine. The problem was it didn't stop singing when the water was ready. It kept going. For how long? 3 days. Harry looked at her. 3 days. Morning to night. Same song as well. Something they'd heard on the wireless, some sort of march. I can still hear it if I'm not careful. She closed her eyes briefly, as though checking. Yes, still there. What did you do with it? Used a different kettle. You can't just stop a charm that's taken properly. It has to run its course or be properly reversed. And reversing it was above their level, above mine, actually. I'm very good at household magic, but this was something Fred had invented essentially from scratch. And unpicking invented magic is tricky. She sighed. Arthur thought it was wonderful. He said it added character to the kitchen. I told him he was welcome to move the teapot to his shed, which he did for about a day before admitting it was too much even for him. Harry was laughing again. Not the contained, careful laugh from before. This one had gotten away from him slightly, which he noticed only after it happened. He pressed his hand to his mouth, not because it needed to be quiet, but because it surprised him, the ease of it. Molly was laughing too. Not the way someone laughs at a prepared joke, a looser laugh. The kind that comes from a memory that has had enough time to become purely good. The thing is, she said when they'd both finished, they were so pleased with themselves. Even after the ceiling, even after the teapot, they were never sorry in the way I maybe wanted them to be sorry. They were sorry for the inconvenience, genuinely. Fred especially always hated it when I had extra work because of them. But they weren't sorry about the trying. She said this without any particular emphasis, as though it was simply a description rather than something she'd thought about. But Harry heard the thing inside it. You didn't want them to be sorry about the trying, he said. It came out less like a question than a confirmation. Molly looked at him. No, she said. I didn't. The kitchen held the word quietly. Outside, the evening was arriving properly now. The light through the window, the long gold of later afternoon, starting its slow change toward something warmer. Upstairs, the sounds of the house had shifted. More movement, more voices. The particular energy of people beginning to orient themselves toward dinner without yet coming down for it. Harry looked at the apple crumble on the counter, at the pot on the stove, at the table he'd laid, with the forks on the left and the large spoon at Ron's place. He thought about Fred and George at 8, their charm written down. Their intentions good, their results both wrong and wonderful. He thought about being sorry for the inconvenience, but not for the trying. He had spent, he thought, quite a lot of time being sorry. Not always for the right things. Sometimes for the trying itself, for the fact of taking up space, of wanting something, of assuming that wanting was allowed. The Dursleys had been efficient about installing that particular sorry, and it had taken up residence so quietly that he had not always noticed it was there. He noticed it now, and he noticed that nobody in this kitchen had ever asked him to feel it. He had come in through the back door and cut up carrots and parsnips and shallots. He had moved over when asked and adjusted his grip. and set the table with the forks on the wrong side first. None of these things had been treated as anything other than someone helping in a kitchen on a summer evening, which was all they were. He wasn't sure he had fully understood until this afternoon what it felt like to just be doing something. The sound of feet on stairs, more than one set coming quickly, returned him to the present. "That'll be Ron and Ginny," Molly said, glancing at the ceiling in the manner of someone interpreting footstep acoustics. "And possibly the twins, if they've stopped arguing about whatever they were arguing about at 4:30. She looked at the stove with the assessing air of someone calculating arrival time versus readiness, and apparently found the calculation satisfactory. "About 10 minutes, she said. Harry stood up from the table. "What should I do?" Molly looked at him, then at the kitchen, at the pot and the crumble and the table with its 2 sizes of glasses, and back at him. "Nothing," she said. "You've done plenty." He stood there for a moment, receiving this. It was a small thing, just 2 words about a weekday evening dinner, but it sat in him without resistance, the way things do when they find the exact space they were shaped for. "All right," he said, and he sat back down. The bowl of batter came down without much warning. One moment it was on the counter where Molly had set it, pushed to the back, away from the activity near the stove, which was where Harry had assumed things went when they were finished being needed. The next moment, it wasn't. He'd reached past it for the dish towel. His elbow caught the edge, and the bowl moved, with the quiet inevitability of things that have been waiting at the edge of something for a while. This one, unlike the cream-colored bowl from earlier, was not charmed. It hit the floor with a sound that was both less and more than Harry expected. Less dramatic, more final. And the batter went in 3 directions at once, generously. Across the flagstone and up the cabinet door and, with a kind of lateral enthusiasm, across the left side of Harry's shoe. He stood very still. The reflex came immediately, the old one, wired in from years before he had words for it. The sharp internal brace, the breath held, the rapid assessment of how bad this was, and whether apology would help, or whether he was past the point where apology was useful. His shoulders had come up before he'd consciously registered the sound of the bowl hitting the floor. He looked at the batter on the floor. He looked at his shoe. He waited. Molly turned from the stove. She looked at the bowl. She looked at the floor. She looked at Harry, who was still standing with his shoulders somewhere near his ears, and an expression he was not fully controlling. "Oh, that happens every single evening." Just that, not "don't worry" in the way that implied there was something to worry about. Not "it's fine" in the way that meant she was deciding not to make something of it. Just a plain statement of frequency, delivered in the tone of someone reporting weather. Harry's shoulders came down. Not all the way, not immediately. It was more of a gradual release, like tension that has been held for long enough to have forgotten what it was originally about, and is simply now ready to stop. He breathed out. "I'll clean it up," he said. "We'll clean it up," Molly said, in the mild corrective way she had, that didn't feel like correction. She was already crossing to the cupboard under the sink, from which she produced a cloth and a small bucket with the ease of someone who knew exactly where these things were, because they had been needed in this kitchen before, many times. She handed him the cloth. He crouched down and began dealing with the batter on the floor, and Molly dealt with the cabinet door. And neither of them said anything for a moment, which was the comfortable kind of nothing rather than the strained kind. The wireless had moved on to something slow and instrumental. The pot on the stove had settled into a steady, satisfied simmer. "The bowl," Harry said, "because it needed a dressing, isn't charmed. The other one was, the cream one." "Most of them are," Molly agreed, wiping down the cabinet. "I haven't gotten to that one yet. It's on the list." "You have a list?" "A mental one. The charm takes a bit of time to do properly, and I keep meaning to sit down and do the remainder, but there's always something. Arthur offered to help. I considered this and declined." "Because?" "Because Arthur is wonderful, and his household charms have a way of doing the intended thing and also several unintended things simultaneously. And I would rather have a bowl that falls on the floor occasionally than a bowl that cushions its own landing but also begins to levitate at mealtimes." Harry considered this risk assessment. "Has that happened?" "The bread bin," Molly said simply. 3 summers ago. It meant well." He finished with the floor, stood, and looked at his shoe. The batter on the side of it had begun to develop opinions about being there permanently. Molly looked at the shoe. "Sink, cold water, quickly." He went to the sink and ran cold water over the side of the shoe, which was awkward because he was still wearing it, but which was clearly the right approach because the batter came off without debate, leaving only a darker patch of leather that would dry out fine. He straightened up, turned off the tap, and stood on one slightly damp foot. Molly was already back at the stove. "Done," he said. "Good." That was it. The bowl was in the sink, the floor was clean, his shoe was dealt with. The kitchen looked, 2 minutes after the incident, essentially as it had looked before. And Molly was checking the pot with the focused attention of someone whose mind had already moved fully back to where it needed to be. Harry stood at the sink for a moment. He had been braced for something, not consciously, not with any specific expectation, just the general low-level preparedness for the moment to become more than it had been, for it to acquire weight. It hadn't acquired weight. It was just a bowl that had fallen and been cleaned up. And now they were past it, and the kitchen continued. He dried his hands on the dish towel. "What needs doing?" he asked. Molly looked around with her assessor's gaze. "The table wants a few more things," she said. "Serving spoons, in the drawer with the cutlery, the larger ones at the back, 2 of those, and the salt and pepper. They're on the windowsill. And the bread, loaves in the basket on top of the refrigerator, if you'd put it on the table with the breadboard." Harry went to the drawer. The serving spoons were at the back, as promised. He retrieved 2 and brought them to the table. Then the salt and pepper from the windowsill, which had been sitting in the sun long enough to be warm to the touch. Then the bread. The loaf was large and had the solid, settled quality of something homemade. He carried it with the breadboard to the table and set it near the middle where everyone could reach. He stood back and looked at the table. It was filling up, glasses and plates and cutlery, and now the salt and the bread. The table becoming more itself with each addition, more ready. "Butter," Molly called, from somewhere behind him. He found the butter in the refrigerator and put it next to the bread. And the water jug, the large glass one, cabinet above the bread bin. He found the jug, filled it at the tap, brought it to the table. "Ron will put too much butter on his bread and then look surprised at himself," Molly said, from behind him, in a tone that was entirely equable. "Every time?" "Without exception, since about age 5. I've stopped commenting. It doesn't help, and he looks genuinely confused each time, as though this has never happened before." Harry set the jug down on the table and looked at the butter, and thought about Ron's face, and felt warm. He was straightening a glass that hadn't needed straightening when Molly said, without particular preamble, "You're good at this, you know." He turned around. She was at the stove, not looking at him, adjusting the heat under the pot with the same practical attention she brought to everything. "At what?" Harry said. The question came out before he had a chance to consider whether he wanted to ask it, or whether it might be better to simply accept whatever the sentence was going to be. "Being in a kitchen with someone." She glanced up briefly, then back to the stove. "Some people find it uncomfortable. They get in the way, or they hover, or they need to be told every single thing. You just fit it in." Harry didn't say anything. He stood at the table and looked at the wall above the stove, where the clock was, and watched the hands. All 9 of them. One for each person this house held in its counting. And thought about what fitting in was. He had never thought of it as a skill, specifically, something you were good at. It had felt, when he came into the kitchen through the back door this afternoon, less like competence and more like need. The need to do something, to have a role, to not be standing in a garden not knowing what to do with his own afternoon. It had not felt like ease. It had felt like relief. But perhaps, he thought, those were not always different things. "I didn't really do that much," he said, because it was true, and it felt important to say it. "You did enough," Molly said. "And you stayed." Stayed sat in the air of the kitchen for a moment. He thought about what staying meant in a kitchen like this. Not just physically remaining, but staying present, staying willing, not retreating when the bowl fell. And the braced part of him had wanted to make itself as small and apologetic as possible. He had stayed. He'd cleaned it up, dried his hands, and asked what needed doing. He wasn't sure anyone had ever told him that was something. He turned back to the table and made a small adjustment to the position of the breadboard that it didn't need because his hands wanted something to do. "Ginny set the table every Thursday when she was small," Molly said, behind him. Not to redirect, just the flow of her. The stories that surfaced and surfaced. She took it very seriously. She'd come and ask me on Wednesday evening whether there was anything special to set out for Thursday, any occasion, anyone coming. And I'd say no, just the family, just a Thursday. And she'd nod as though this was important information and go away and think about it. And then, Thursday evenings, the table would have something new on it. A flower from the garden in a glass of water. Or she'd have folded the napkins into something, not very successfully at first, but she kept practicing. Or she'd put a candle in the middle when there was no particular reason for a candle. Molly's voice was fond and quiet. Arthur asked her once why she did it, all the extra things. She said she was maybe 7. She said she wanted Thursdays to look like they mattered. Harry stood at the table with his hands resting on the back of a chair and said nothing. He looked at the water jug and the bread and the butter and the glasses in 2 sizes and the salt and pepper warm from the window and the large spoon at Ron's place, and thought about Thursdays that looked like they mattered. He thought about the table at Privet Drive, the precise opposite engineering, the careful removal of anything extra, anything that might suggest celebration or warmth, or the idea that an ordinary evening was worth marking. Meals at Privet Drive were fuel, and an opportunity for Vernon to talk. And they happened at the table because that was where meals happened. And they did not have water jugs or candles or flowers in glasses. He had not known, at 7, that tables could be made to look like they mattered. He thought he was beginning to understand why Ginny had wanted that. The instinct behind it. The sense that here, on this ordinary Thursday, with these specific people, something worth marking was occurring. Not a special occasion, Just this. Just dinner. Just everyone in the same room. Just the most ordinary magic there was. Upstairs, the sounds had changed character. The movement was more directional now. Footsteps heading toward the stairs rather than between rooms. Voices picking up with the particular energy of people converging on something. 2 minutes, Molly said. To the pot or to the evening generally? She was ladling something into a large serving bowl. Unhurried but precise. The focused economy of someone in the final stage of a project. Harry looked at the table one more time. He thought it looked like it mattered. He pulled out his chair and sat down, and he put his hands flat on the table, which was scarred and warm from the afternoon sun that had crossed it. And he felt the particular stillness of a moment just before something becomes what it was always going to become. The footsteps on the stairs were getting louder. He realized, looking forward to dinner. Not in the tense way he sometimes looked forward to things, the way that was mostly hoping they would go well, mostly managing the space between now and then. Just simply, straightforwardly, with no complication in it. He was looking forward to dinner. In this kitchen, at this table. That was all. That was enough. They came down all at once, the way the Weasleys tended to do things. Not planned, there was. No signal. No call to dinner. Molly hadn't announced anything. It was as though the house itself had reached a temperature that meant now. And everyone in it had felt the change at the same moment and responded accordingly. Harry heard them on the stairs first. Multiple sets of feet, overlapping. Someone telling someone else to move. Someone else already talking about something that had apparently been in progress for some time and required no introduction. Then the kitchen doorway was full. Ron came in first, still talking, already reaching past Ginny, who was directly behind him, to point at something he was describing to Fred, who came in sideways because he and George were in the middle of a disagreement conducted entirely in gestures. Mr. Weasley was behind them all, ducking slightly under the doorframe out of long habit, his expression the one he wore in the evenings. Quieter than his daytime version. Settled. Glad to be home. The kitchen, which had been Harry's and Molly's for the better part of an afternoon, became the Weasley kitchen in approximately 10 seconds. It was loud immediately. Not the loud of something going wrong. The loud of a family that had been separated into different rooms for several hours and had things to report. Fred and George's gestural disagreement converted itself into a spoken one, involving something that had happened with Percy's prefect badge and a permanent sticking charm. Percy denied having anything to do with it from somewhere on the stairs, his voice arriving before he did, carrying the particular tone of someone making a formal statement for the record. Mr. Weasley sat down at the table, noticed the water jug, and poured himself a glass with the contented air of someone who had been thinking about a glass of water without knowing it. Ginny slid into her seat and immediately began tearing off a piece of bread without waiting, which earned a look from Molly that communicated volumes across the kitchen without a single word. "We're sitting down first," Molly said, to the room in general. "I'm sitting down," Ginny said reasonably, and she was. Ron dropped into his chair. His hand went immediately to the large spoon beside his plate. He picked it up, looked at it, and looked across the table at Harry with an expression of mild, genuine wonder. "Did you—" he started. "Your mum said you'd need it," Harry said. Ron looked at the spoon, then at Harry, then back at the spoon, as though this chain of events was worth examining carefully. "She's not wrong," he said. and put the spoon down beside his plate with the careful placement of something he intended to use shortly. Molly moved between stove and table, setting down the serving bowl, then the pot. The apple crumble was already on the counter waiting for after. The bread was being passed before anyone had asked for it to be. And Mr. Weasley said something to Fred that made George laugh before Fred did, which seemed to resolve their ongoing disagreement without anyone having to be right about it. Percy came in last, made a brief survey of the table, and adjusted his cutlery by a fraction before sitting down. Harry watched him do it and said nothing, but he felt the warm, private knowledge of it. Percy and his ruler at 6. Percy at 15, still the same person, just with more years on the habit. He thought of what Molly had said. They needed different things. He thought of Bill's rocks, still in a box somewhere upstairs, holding their long, patient silences. He thought he understood now, more than he had this morning. Mr. Weasley looked down the table, and his eyes found Harry, with the uncomplicated warmth of someone who is simply glad to see a person they like. "Good evening, Harry," he said. "I've been thinking all day about a question for you." "I'm ready," Harry said. "Escalators," said Mr. Weasley. "When they stop working, Muggles call them stairs. Is this a common saying, or something specific to—" "Arthur," said Molly, setting down the serving spoon. "After dinner," Mr. Weasley said agreeably, and reached for the bread. The food went around the table in the way of meals where nobody is coordinating it, but it somehow reaches everyone anyway. The bowl passed left, then right, someone reaching across someone else without apology. The pot lifted by whoever was closest. Harry served himself when the bowl came to him and passed it on. And nobody noted this. Nobody mocked it. And that was the exact right thing. He was at the table. He was eating. The food was warm and good. Better than good, actually. The stew, rich with the hours it had been on the stove. The bread, dense and soft. And around him the conversation had split into 3 separate threads that occasionally intersected and occasionally didn't. Ginny was telling Ron something he was pretending not to find interesting. The twins had moved on from the prefect badge to a new topic that Percy was pretending not to hear. Harry ate his stew and listened to all of it, not tracking any single thread, but taking in the whole of it. The sound of this family at this table, the particular music of it. He passed the butter to Mr. Weasley without being asked, because Mr. Weasley had been looking at it. Mr. Weasley accepted it, with the pleased surprise of someone who hadn't known he needed the butter until it arrived. Ron put too much butter on his bread. He looked at it for a second, with mild, genuine surprise. Harry said nothing. Ron took a large bite. At some point, without any particular moment marking it, Harry stopped waiting for the evening to become what it was, and simply let it be what it already was. He was at the table. He had helped make the meal on it. The stew was good, and the kitchen was warm, and everyone in the room had handed him something today without making a ceremony of the handing. Molly making room at the counter. The bowl that had fallen and been cleaned up without weight. The forks corrected once and not revisited. The word stayed, offered into the kitchen air as though it were the most ordinary praise. Across the table, Ron was arguing cheerfully about Quidditch with Fred. Ginny was quietly winning an entirely separate argument with George. Percy was explaining something to Mr. Weasley in the precise and detailed way of someone who has been waiting to explain it. And Mr. Weasley was listening, with the full and genuine attention he brought to everything, as though nothing Percy was telling him could be less than fascinating. And Molly sat at the head of the table, passing the bread when it ran low, refilling the water jug when it needed refilling, laughing at something Fred said, giving Percy the particular look she reserved for moments when he was technically right about something and she wasn't going to say so. And the kitchen held all of it. The noise and the warmth and the overlapping voices and the evening coming in gold through the window. Harry looked at the table. He looked at the clock on the wall. The 9 hands resting now at home. All of them. Something settled in him, quietly, without announcement, the way the last piece of something fits when you've stopped forcing it and simply let it find its place. He had been welcomed into a lot of things. Hogwarts, his house, the Quidditch team. He understood those. They had doors and ceremonies and names. This didn't have any of those. Nobody had said, "You belong here." Nobody had said, "This is yours too." Nobody had said any of the things you might say if you were trying to make a person feel at home. Ron had passed him the stew. Mr. Weasley had wanted to ask about escalators. Molly had moved over at the counter and handed him a roll. The butter had arrived when Mr. Weasley needed it. That was the whole of it. That was everything. The most ordinary magic there was, and the most powerful. And Harry sat in the middle of it and felt something he did not yet have the right word for, only that it was warm, and it was his, and it was enough.